Hello and welcome to Committee Corridor. What if your experiences could directly impact government policy? If, by offering your views, members of Parliament could spotlight concerns, form recommendations to bring about change and make a difference? Welcome to Committee Corridor, where MPs from different political parties work together as a select committee to ask questions of real people, experts and leaders and put their findings to government, which must respond. Committee Corridor is a real place, running above the House of Commons all the way to the House of Lords in the Palace of Westminster. And when Parliament is sitting, you can watch, in person or online, as committee members put political party differences aside to dig deep into the pressing issues of the day. I'm Meg Hillier, Chair of the Treasury Committee. I also chair the Liaison Committee, which brings together all the committee chairs to make sure we're doing our jobs effectively. And for the first 2 episodes of this brand new series, I'm presenting Committee Corridor. In this first episode, we wanted to look at select committee impact, past, present and future. Later, we'll be hearing from some brand new committee members who have taken their first steps down Committee Corridor and into the committee rooms. We'll be asking how it's going and what their wishes are for the future of select committees in this Parliament. But first, we're returning to work carried over from the last Parliament into this one. A landmark inquiry by the Defence Committee on women in the armed forces. The committee's report, Protecting Those Who Protect Us, Women in the Armed Forces from Recruitment to Civilian Life, was a key one in the committee's history. And it involved a lot of distressing evidence, from serious cases of bullying, harassment and discrimination to criminal acts such as sexual assault and rape. I'm joined now by 2 women who played an integral part in the inquiry before we hear from the current chair of the Defence Committee. Emma Norton is a solicitor and director of the Centre for Military Justice, which offers independent legal advice to men and women in the armed forces and those closest to them. Sarah Atherton led the committee's inquiry in the last Parliament while representing Wrexham as a Conservative MP. She was the first female MP to have served in the regular armed forces, and she continues to keep in touch with the committee's inquiry. A warm welcome to you both.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Hello, Meg and Emma. Thank you for having me today.
Emma, if I could start with you, your charity, the Centre for Military Justice, which I think we'll call the CMJ, was a fairly young charity when you submitted written evidence to the committee's inquiry back in 2021, and then appeared in front of MPs to answer their questions. What drove you to take part?
Well, it was a bit of a baptism of fire. We were very young, as you say. We actually only set up in December 2019. And the charity had been set up to really provide independent legal advice and advocacy services and signposting for women, really, in the armed forces who we knew from our own direct experience were having very, very serious problems across a whole range of different areas. But the area that we were really interested in, really wanted to support women to do something about, was the issues around sexual harassment and sexual assault. We were receiving a lot of inquiries from women who were just not able to secure justice as they saw it. And then it happened around the same time in early 2020. Ben Wallace rejected the recommendations of what was called the Lions Review, which was this independent review into the military justice system. And so very quickly, we were involved in some litigation acting for 3 women who wanted to challenge his rejection of those recommendations. And that was around the time that Sarah was looking into these issues and wanting to convene a wider inquiry about those issues. So it was quite a good sort of coming together, I think, of the sort of the political and the legal. And then it just really took a life of its own because, as Sarah will tell you, all of these women came forward and just wanted to tell their stories. And so from that to sort of be very quickly asked to give evidence at a committee inquiry, which I'd never done before, was really quite an overwhelming experience. But it was a very, very good experience.
It sounds like quite a roller coaster then, you're establishing clearly a need with all these women coming forward to you. Can I ask, when Sarah and the committee put the report out, it found that when things go wrong, they go dramatically wrong. From your experience, Emma, would you say that's the case?
100%. A lot of the women that contact us, so a typical profile will be a woman has tolerated unacceptable behaviours for a really long time. And she hasn't made a formal complaint about it. And that's for lots of reasons, because they don't want to be seen as a troublemaker. They don't want to be labelled as a woman who makes reports. They want to show that they can take a joke. And it may just be that they just become acclimatized to the culture and they're putting up with stuff with they really shouldn't be putting up with. But that is the typical profile. And then something big happens, like something even bigger happens, like a sexual assault or like a really, really extreme form of sexual harassment. And they try and make a complaint about it. And that's when the problems start. Lots of the women say to us, the sexual assault was obviously awful and terrible, but actually what was worse was the way the Army, the Navy, the RAF treated me or reacted towards me when I had the audacity to report it or insist that something was done about it. And then what they're describing is sort of patterns of victimization or coming up against this really appalling kind of rape myths and victim blaming that I'm afraid is clearly a problem in wider society, but particularly acute in the very masculine environment of the armed forces.
Sarah, can you tell us what prompted the Defence Committee to start this work? And was there a reason to set up a separate subcommittee?
Well, I had no idea who Emma was at the time and what she was working on. I was a new MP. I'd been elected onto the Defence Select Committee. I'm a veteran myself. And I was asked by the chair at the time, Tobias Elwood, would I look into the lived experiences of women in the military because they were overrepresented year on year in the complaint system, and the recruitment targets had also continually been missed.
It's interesting you say that, Sarah, because you were, as you say, you served in the armed forces as a woman yourself. I think you were the first non-commissioned officer female MP. Is that right?
I was the first MP with a regular military background, according to the House of Commons Library. And I am certainly non-commissioned as well. So I suppose there's two wins there. But I served in the 80s and it was hard. The language used was hard. And it was of its time. Once on the committee, I was tasked with looking at the lived experiences of women in the military. But it was one of the largest inquiries ever undertaken in Parliament. We received 4,106 pieces of evidence and testimonials. And for the first time ever, the Defence Instruction Notice was lifted. And this is an order whereby, as a serving personnel, you can talk to your MP about a pothole in the road in front of your house, but you were forbidden for talking to MPs about your service. And Ben Wallace at the time lifted the Defence Instruction Notice. So this, for the first time, gave service personnel an opportunity to be heard. And they really wanted to be heard, and they wanted to be heard en masse. It also included regulars and reserves, and it also included veterans. And we had about half and a half split between veterans and serving. And the results were truly shocking. And they were wide-ranging also and broad in their nature. So some of the evidence, just to give you a flavour, was that when women are on deployment, they couldn't obtain sanitary products. So they were having to tear up clothing to use for sanitary towels. When they were firing in foxholes, there was a requirement to have your hair in a bun, but then you couldn't fit your helmet on your head properly and securely and appropriately with a bun. At the same time, you were in a firing position wearing men's body armour, which obviously didn't fit the female form, the boobs, the hips, the waist. So it would lift up, exposing organs from underneath your arms. So not only are you trying to fire at the enemy with your helmet tilted over your eyes, but all underneath your arms was exposed. This was just jaw-dropping for someone like me to think that, yes, I accepted that in the 80s, but things hadn't moved on. There was no neonatal, perinatal, postnatal health policies. There were no female-specific health policies at all. A lot of women were leaving, not because they wanted to, because they couldn't balance being a wife, a mother, a soldier, aviator, or sailor. They just couldn't balance those roles. 6 out of 10 women wouldn't complain if they had a complaint, and you were 4 to 6 times less likely to get a conviction for serious sexual assault or rape in a court-martial compared to the civilian courts. But interestingly, having said all that, and there was an awful lot more, 9 out of 10 women would recommend a career in the military.
Well, that shows a real dedication, doesn't it? That people still believe in it, even with these challenges.
Absolutely.
You then produced your report, and as a result, and part of that, you brought the ministers and key military leaders back before the committee for an annual follow-up. Did you see any progress?
So initially we saw progress, albeit glacial progress. It was very, very slow, with the sort of low-hanging fruit aspects of the recommendations we made. And the MOD accepted most of the recommendations, nearly all, but not all. So things like female health policies, wraparound childcare, kits and equipment. It's taken years, Meg, for this to come in, but it is by and large and broadly there. There are some concerns about body armour. Actually, they've designed new body armour. They didn't just go to our NATO allies and say, well, that's working for you, we'll adopt that. The MOD procured their own, and there is some concern about body armour not actually doing the job it was meant to do. Over the last few years, there's been a lot of initiatives put in place. I'd like to think that these initiatives were now reassessed to make sure they are making the positive impact on the ground. I think some of them probably aren't, but change has been made in those areas. But there are still areas which we have problems with. From the feedback I get, and I still get service personnel contacting me at least once a fortnight asking for help, although I'm no longer in Parliament, which actually says a lot for the welfare systems that are in place in the MOD, if they think that the only place they can turn to for help is me. So that speaks for itself. But I feel that there's been a bit of backsliding on the culture, the bystander culture. And if anything, I think that's probably getting worse.
It's interesting you mentioned the bystander point. Perhaps I can turn to Emma on that, because certainly when you in other campaigns, for instance, around school bullying, the role of the bystander has been critical. You presumably are getting these complaints, Emma, as long if Sarah is getting them as a former MP, you must still be getting them through the charity. Are you picking up that issue as well, where people perhaps aren't standing up for colleagues who are put into this difficult situation?
Absolutely. It's leading to victimisation. The MOD is wonderful at appearing before a committee and saying, we accept we could do better. Here is a whole range of wonderful things that we're going to bring in. And Sarah is absolutely right to call it low-hanging fruit. It's often, I have to say, a misrepresentation of what they're actually going to do. And I can give some examples of that. But the issue about bystanding is so frustrating because that's been one of their flags, hasn't it, Sarah? It's like, we now have active bystander training. It's amazing. And it's part of the Army's values and standards. You're going to stand up and you're going to call it out. Well, we get calls regularly from women who are calling it out and who then all of a sudden are finding their own work called into question and who are being targeted and being made themselves to be the subject of complaints because they're seen as a pain in the neck.
And I mean, Emma, the government did announce changes to the complaints system at the committee's most recent session. Do you think that those initiatives will create any meaningful change?
We're going to have to wait and see. We have to greet it with some degree of cautious optimism, but healthy scepticism as well, because it was announced very, very late in the day. Just as recently as 3 weeks previously, the Ministry of Defence's position has been that they are not going to introduce an independent aspect to the service complaints process. They were very, very clear about that on the penultimate day of the Jaisley Beck inquest. That was their evidence. And then all of a sudden, following 3 weeks of very intense press pressure, largely driven by the Beck family on what are you going to do to improve things for the service complaints process, all of a sudden they come up with this. And they announced it at midnight the day before their witnesses are giving evidence before the Defence Committee, where they knew they were going to get a grilling. It's incredibly concerning, and I'm a little bit sceptical about it. However, we have been calling for years for there to be an independent body that would oversee and handle serious service complaints. Sarah's committee called for the same thing. Some years before that, the Wigston Review called for the same thing. And our point was, you need to take the handling of these most serious complaints, not all of them, but the most serious ones, away from the single services because they cannot be trusted to mark their own homework. Now, on one analysis, that may be what they are now proposing. They're calling it a tri-service body. I don't know what that's going to look like. I don't know who's going to populate it. If it's just the same people with the same attitudes, with a different hat on, then clearly that's not going to work. So there has to be meaningful independence. One of the things that concerns me is that they didn't give this job to the Armed Forces Commissioner. So they're in the process of designing and passing through Parliament an Armed Forces Commissioner who's going to be properly, genuinely independent. Why not give that job to that body when it is set up? And it concerns me, and I'm a little bit cynical that they haven't done that. But I do think we do need to recognise that it's further than they've ever gone before.
Look, I mean, the report concluded ultimately that the Ministry of Defence and Services were failing to help female personnel achieve their full potential, which is, as you touched on, Sarah, earlier, quite tragically sad, really. Do you think that the report has helped to change the situation? I mean, what as the chair of that inquiry, are you proudest of, Sarah?
I think the biggest success that I haven't actually achieved and would like to achieve is to have all rape cases heard automatically in civilian courts. That's what I was really, really aiming for. I'm proud of everything that we've done, because there are a lot of women and men out there that have been trying for years but weren't in that position that I was in, stood in the chamber, asking very difficult questions of ministers and being able to challenge service chiefs in front of the camera. I was able to do that. There've been lots of people who've been trying to enact change and just came across this brick wall that Emma has spoken about. So rape in civilian courts, we didn't achieve. I would like that to have happened. And also the adoption of the term military sexual trauma, because when a term is adopted, it's acknowledged. When it's acknowledged, there's policy change and there's funding put behind it. They haven't adopted that term of MST. On the back of this inquiry, I spent a year with the OVA and experts in the field looking at the needs of female veterans. And of course, military sexual trauma is a frequent feature in the lives of female veterans. And we did some excellent work. We pulled on all the brains and the expertise we could in the country and produced this recommendation, the strategy with recommendations. And the OVA were behind it at the time. We were at the point of launching the very first female veteran strategy, but there was a delay. And the delay was the MOD didn't like the term MST. And of course, a general election was called. It fell. And the minister has now announced that they're not going to rebrand and launch that. They're just going to refine the veteran strategy to have acknowledgement of females in it. So that is something that's a missed opportunity.
Emma, if I can turn to you, you've got a strong legal background. You're director of the Centre for Military Justice. But what do you think you got from having the House of Commons, the Defence Select Committee, and conducting an inquiry on this that you wouldn't have achieved on your own?
Oh, I mean, a huge amount. I mean, essentially what Sarah's work did was bring this issue into the public domain in a way that had never, ever happened before. And it did that in an incredibly effective, well-evidenced, measured way that has had a number of really important effects, not least it has enabled women to feel like they're being heard. Sarah was talking about feeling like they're banging their head against a brick wall. That's exactly right. And that's how women who contact me always feel like they're alone and they're isolated and they are trying to function as best they can in an institution that is not capable of delivering justice for them. And the report of the Defence Select Committee really vindicated those women. It really vindicated them. And it enabled them to give that testimony, which was so powerful. We supported a number of women to give evidence in writing. It's important to mention, it was only in writing. Mr. Wallace would not want to have those women giving evidence directly in front of the committee, I notice, but he was willing to grant them that. And that was an incredibly powerful thing. And that evidence will always be there. It's always public. It's always going to be there. And I think that was really, really brilliant. And in some recent evidence that was given to the Defence Select Committee, the minister in question has made very clear that he is not presently minded to act upon those recommendations from the Lyons Review, from the Atherton Review, that would have created a legal presumption that in most cases, serious cases of rape, serious sexual assault should go to the civilian justice system. And that is an incredibly disappointing turn of events given their very clear position when they were in opposition. And I think when you look at the statistics for completed rape trials at court-martial and you compare them with the statistics for completed rape trials at Crown Court, those figures are markedly different, not just a little bit different. If it was a little bit, there could be some wriggle room, perhaps some explanations. They are markedly different. And the government is going to have to come up with some very good explanations as to why they consider that to be an acceptable state of affairs for women and men who suffer these kinds of crimes.
Well, I think clearly this issue is not dead and buried, and it's good to know that the current Defence Committee is picking up where Sarah Atherton's inquiry left off. But look, if I can finish on this point, Sarah, you were very clear as a committee, to make the specific point of thanking all the service personnel and the veterans who contributed to the inquiry. Can you tell me why you think that was so important?
Yes, so there's something called career fouling. So when women complain, and as Emma touched on earlier, they tend to find opportunities closed to them, counter complaints, harassment, bullying of their own. So women are very fearful of actually mentioning a complaint. 6 out of 10 don't complain for that reason. But they'd had decades of this pent-up frustration that no one was listening to them. No one was taking them seriously. They were disempowered. They didn't know where to go. And suddenly they had an opportunity to do that. So in one breath, they wanted to contribute, but in the second breath, they were very scared to contribute. And they had to put their trust in me, someone they'd never met before, that I was going to handle their data anonymously and appropriately. So when they came forward and I read some of the evidence, and some of these women phoned me up and phoned my team up. Some of them were suicidal. But myself as a new MP, but I have been 27 years as a nurse and social worker, I could not just put that phone down. I needed somewhere to go and to send and to signpost these women. There was only one charity that came forward to help me, and that was a charity up in the northeast called Salute Her. A charity run by females for female service personnel. At that time, I phoned them up and they said, yes, we'll help you. And they were a lifesaver for me running this committee. At that time, they had 75 women on their books, and they manage the high-end problematic cases of sexual assault, military sexual trauma. At that point in 2021, they had 75 people on their caseload. They've got over 5,000 now since this work began. That's why I wanted to say thank you. That's why I wanted to say to these women, we did it together. It wasn't me. I just happened to be the front of house. We did it together, and you can take solace and credit in how we've improved the situation, not just for them, but for service women of the future. And that's why it's incredibly important to me to say thank you.
Well, can I thank you both as well, Emma Norton from the Director of the Centre for Military Justice, and Sarah Atherton, who led this groundbreaking piece of work. You've really clearly made a difference, and it's been very interesting to hear your thoughts on this today. But I think we can all agree there's still work for the current Defence Select Committee on this issue. Thank you very much. I'm joined now by Dhesi, the Labour Member of Parliament for Slough, who is the current chair of the Defence Committee. This inquiry began life in the last Parliament under a different chair and different membership. A new committee in a new Parliament doesn't have to pick up the work of the former one, but you did. Why was it important to return to this inquiry?
When I became chair of the Defence Committee, I wanted to make sure that the new committee picked up the important work undertaken by the previous committee, but left unfinished because of the general election. A lot of time, effort, and taxpayers' money had been expended on it, where the previous committee had not only conducted an extensive inquiry, but held the previous government to account for progress every year since 2021. It was clear we needed to continue to hold the government to account, especially given the findings of the service inquiries into the tragic deaths of Gunner Jaisley Beck and Officer Cadet Olivia Perks, the non-statutory inquiries into unacceptable behaviours in the Red Arrows and submarine service, and allegations of a hostile and toxic culture with respect to women within the Ministry of Defence.
You recently gathered the chiefs of the Army, Navy and Air Force to assess their progress against the committee's report. How will you take this work forward?
The fact that all three service chiefs gave evidence together hopefully shows the seriousness that the Armed Forces senior leadership and the government give to these issues. Sometimes you can achieve a result as a parliamentary select committee simply by showing focus and promising to take evidence. And in this case, we achieved a result even before the session took place. The government announced that morning, and I'm sure the timing was no coincidence, that they were making fundamental changes to the service's complaint system, finally taking cases of bullying, harassment and discrimination out of the single services chain of command. This is in line with one of the handful of recommendations from Sarah and the committee's original report that hadn't previously been agreed and implemented, and is an important result, not just for our committee, but also for those campaigners and families who've given so much energy and care to these issues over the years. We want to ensure that government follows through on its promises and that policies are implemented fully. Change needs to be felt on the ground by the service women themselves, and that will be what we will be looking for throughout this parliament.
It's clear that progress is being made, but there's still work to do. More than half of the House of Commons is represented on select committees. We are cross-party groups of MPs tasked with following the work of a particular government department or an issue spanning policy such as the environment. Following a general election, membership of select committees is worked out in proportion to the results. This means that Labour has the largest number of committee spots, followed by Conservative and Liberal Democrat parties. Sometimes smaller parties are allocated committees too, usually to reflect their interest in particular topics. So what's it like to take your seat in a committee room for the very first time? I wanted to speak to some newly minted committee recruits to hear their first impressions and what the future of this parliament looks like to them. So let's get started. Steff Aquarone is the Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament for North Norfolk and has joined the Transport Select Committee. Natasha Irons is the Labour Member of Parliament for Croydon East and joins the Culture, Media and Sport Committee. Welcome to Committee Corridor. Can I start with you, Steff? Can you tell me what it's been like so far being a member of a select committee?
Well, it's been really reassuring, actually, because the things that matter to rural communities like mine appear to have caught the attention of the committee and be the sorts of things that we're actively looking at. So I know a lot of the grumpy books about Parliament say that one of its few redeeming features is the work of select committees, and that's certainly been my experience so far.
So what are you looking at that's particularly useful for your community?
Well, we've looked at quite a few things very briefly as they've emerged. So obviously Great British Railways, the delays to the driving tests, things like this. But the two big first initial inquiries that we're right in the middle of at the moment are about rural public transport connectivity and the impact of street works, which isn't uniquely a rural thing, but certainly affects communities in my constituency.
Well, certainly quite different for you, Natasha, in Croydon. But what have your first impressions been of the Select Committee corridor?
My first impressions have been really positive. I think it's been really good to see sort of cross-party working and us all, we're all on that committee because we've got an interest in culture or we've got an interest in how, this country tells stories about itself and finding the common ground and things that we all really care about. Both of you are actually on committees where the chair of your committee is from another party. So, Steff, of course, the chair of the Transport Select Committee is Ruth Cadbury, a Labour MP. And Natasha, your chair is Caroline Dinage, who's a Conservative MP. Has that caused you any challenges or has it defied expectations? Steff, perhaps start with you.
It just feels like I'm working with colleagues, genuinely. I think, if anything, we're all slightly aware of the party movements, particularly with something like Great British Rail. And I sense my colleagues take seriously the job, which is ultimately to scrutinise government implementation, government behaviour, government policy. And I think, if anything, there's a sort of hyper-consciousness around that makes cross-party working really viable.
And what about you, Natasha?
I feel like being on a committee is the closest thing I've found in Parliament to being in a normal job. It's a sort of the bit that, when you're in an office in the real world, you work with people who you don't necessarily agree with. You have very difficult political views, perhaps you don't even talk about your political views for the sake of the goodwill in the office. It's quite nice to be backed up when you disagree, perhaps with something the government's doing by other people from other parties, because you're not sort of a lone voice in your own parliamentary group. So it's good to sort of check in with people who aren't on your side. Just be like, am I thinking this is perhaps not the right thing as much as I think it is? And often you can be because you're sense checking it with somebody else, really.
And of course, Natasha, you were elected by your fellow Labour MPs to be on the roll. Steff, how did you get to be a member of the Transport Select Committee from the Liberal Democrats?
Same. I did a lot of early canvassing because it was one that I was really keen to take part in.
So you actually had to go and seek out votes from your colleagues.
Yeah, which was a really interesting way of building relationships with brand new colleagues. I think I've got proportionally even more new colleagues than Natasha has, given that we only had a small number before the election. Now we're at 72 Lib Dem MPs. I really agree with what Natasha's just said. I think the reason why perhaps it's slightly easier is that when you're obviously in a select committee looking at the effectiveness of what the government is doing, it's not just politicians you're scrutinising, it's also government departments and external agencies, and you're hearing evidence from people who really know their stuff. And also by that stage, the policy is written. So, we're not the House of Lords. We're not sense checking policy. We might have different views about whether Great British Railway is a good thing, but actually someone who thinks it isn't a good thing could make a really good interrogator of all the people who are going about doing it. So it doesn't really matter which side of the decision you're on. If you're scrutinising whether it's been effective or not, actually that's a really healthy thing to come to from all sides, really.
And in your experience, I'll go perhaps to Natasha first. What does the public think about select committees? Does it come up on the doorstep in Croydon?
Do you know what? It has actually. My local bowls club were really keen to understand if the committee were going to look at the future of bowls and, the loss of community clubs, what that means for things like loneliness, especially for elder gentlemen in communities like mine. So, yeah, it has to come up. And I've been really surprised by that, because you can feel quite detached from people's everyday lives, but you realise actually when people have an interest in something and a passion about something, they will find out who they need to speak to about it, and they'll find a way of raising it. And it's quite nice to feel like I'm actually able to connect that work with my constituents.
That's great. What about you, Steff?
I think that somewhere in North Norfolk there's a telly stuck on channel 65 or whatever it is.
Surely they're tuning in, Steff, just to see you perform.
I don't know. I think people do watch BBC Parliament, and because we meet generally for our public sessions on Wednesday mornings, there's a fair chance there's nothing else that BBC Parliament can find to put on then. So they go to us, and I get texts saying, like, stop checking your emails and that sort of thing. I'm not checking my emails in select committee meetings. I'm working out the perfect gotcha question, of course. But no, people occasionally see it. I think it's one of those things that very politically tuned in and interested people will probably take an interest in. My constituents probably don't care quite as much about my clever questioning as they do about whether they're going to get a bus somewhere they want to go. And so I really hope that is the kind of lasting outcome of this work, not viral social media clips of squirming, skewered witness providers, but actual improvements in the way that public transport is delivered, for instance.
Well, Natasha, in your committee, you're also pushing at some of the things that government's doing. Do you want to give us a flavour of some of those and what you think about this in the moment impact versus the sort of longer term impact to make sure that things actually change for the better for your constituents?
We've had a joint committee actually about AI and its impact on copyright, because the government's just completed a consultation into that. And it's really interesting to get the views of colleagues and to hear from creatives and people within the tech sector to see, how these two industries help each other and how in many ways can supercharge the future of both of them, but then can also bump up against one another. And there is concern within the creative sector around things like consent and remuneration. And it's really fascinating to sort of be at the centre of that and kind of hear that debate.
Do you find that your colleagues are now beginning to approach you as experts on transport or culture, media and sport?
Nah.
So, Steff, have they yet recognised you as an emerging expert in the area of rural transport?
I think mercifully I have an actual expert in my other colleague, Ollie, who comes from a rail industry background. So on rail we're covered. Perhaps I'm getting a bit more of a rep as a bus fan, which you may have already gathered from this conversation. But it's really interesting hearing Natasha talk about sort of her perspectives through DCMS committee on things like data remuneration for creatives, because my only experience of that has been through the Bill Committee on the Data Use and Access Bill, where obviously I made several impassioned grandstanding speeches, which were all courteously ignored by the government. And that's very useful for me, as a practice spokesperson on issues that I care about.
Natasha, what about you?
No one's coming to me for my expert opinion, but I do feel as if being on the select committee has made it easier to try and get time in with ministers and discuss issues on there, and I think that's been really helpful. I mean, another thing that I'm quite passionate about is young people and youth. In this country, we've seen a 73% cut in the funding for youth services, and that's something that my committee can look at some point. And as the government is planning to do things around youth services and youth provision, it feels like it being in a really good place right now to ask the right questions around that. So just make sure that the consultation that's going out at the moment actually is a genuine consultation with young people, and what does the sector actually think, what do the youth workers actually think. We've had a massive decline in youth work as a practice, and in terms of making sure those people are trained and paid properly. So it feels like a really interesting place to be.
And Steff, you're getting a lot of young people engaged in things like rural transport, and do you think Parliament could be doing more to engage with that group?
Well, the point of public transport is that anyone can use it, but it's particularly valuable for young people trying to get to work and to training opportunities and even just to statutory education. But I think actually I've been really impressed by the work that the House has done on school visits. I've really enjoyed receiving, between me and my colleagues, I think we've got nearly half a dozen, I think, we've either received or got booked in. That's a long way to come from North Norfolk to visit Parliament, but it's a really important experience, especially for people at primary school age, I think, when it just starts to make it part of their world and how they think about things. I've had some astutely brilliant bits of correspondence from some of the pupils that came from some of my primary schools. But yeah, buses matter to everyone, but especially older and younger people.
Fantastic. Look, and I just want to finish asking if you had a wish or prediction for the future of select committees, what would it be?
I suppose my wish would be that people viewed British politics more through the eyes of a select committee rather than the sort of boo-hiss sort of life that the chamber. I wish as a nation we thought of our decision-making processes and our parliament more like the behaviour we see on select committees than we do in the chamber. Not to, I'm not saying it's not fun and funny to sometimes sit in there and hear people scream at each other, but I think a select committee, like I said, just feels more like real life and feels a bit more how you would do real business outside of this place.
So less yaboo than Prime Minister's questions. Steff, what about you?
I really support that, and my expectation and my wish are probably two slightly different things. I expect select committees will have a solid ongoing role because of the role they play in accountability and the fact that they're seen as quite good governance. My wish would be that we got to score every minister and head of department who was a witness and had some sort of league table at the end of the parliamentary session.
Ooh. That's going to scare all the witnesses who are listening to Committee Corridor.
It's going to make them want to come on and visit us and earn the badge of honour. Unfortunately, I don't think that's ever going to happen, so that's okay. But far better than trying to vote on something and make it mandatory. Then it just becomes another extension of the balance of Parliament. But I think if we could somehow incentivise witnesses to be credible and honest and transparent, and to set aside party politics in the way that I think committee members and chairs do, I think we'd get a little bit more out of... and that's not because I want to try and trick them. It's because I think we'll just get more value out of hearing the truth spelled out a little bit more candidly.
Well, amen to that. I think we would all agree we want our witnesses to give clear evidence. And can I thank you both for showing such enthusiasm for the valuable work you do as members of select committees on the Committee Corridor. So there you have it. In this first episode of the new series, we wanted to bring you the story of a select committee inquiry that continues to deliver impact and to look forward to future developments on Committee Corridor. My thanks to all my guests for sharing their insights and to you, our listeners, for tuning in. Next time on Committee Corridor, we'll be looking at the work of the Liaison Committee ahead of our session with the Prime Minister on the 8th of April. It's good to be back. We have a selection of brand new episodes for you, turning over new themes and inquiries right up to the summer recess. Please like and subscribe so that you never miss an episode. You can find all our previous pods by searching UK Parliament plus Committee Corridor. I'm Meg Hillier, and this has been Committee Corridor. Thank you for listening.